Welcome to the Mama Mudra Podcast. I'm Kate Thompson-Duwe, and I believe that the wellness industry has a joy problem, so we're aiming to fix it. This podcast is where we bring in experts to challenge beliefs and tools to feel good, stay consistent, and build a life that works. Because in this community, joy is the new performance metric. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Mama Mudra Podcast. As most of you, I hope, will know by now, because that will show me who's been watching and who hasn't, we speak repeatedly about joy being the true metric of wellness and a good life, as opposed to specific performance-based outcomes. And I speak about this repeatedly across all of my episodes. But it occurred to me recently that it is probably quite hard for many of us to enter into measuring our lives and our success purely on joy when the vast majority, if not all of us, at a certain stage of life will have some stored trauma and stored angst that needs to be dealt with before we can kind of start from a clear base level and start optimizing our lives. So today's episode is one that I've really been looking forward to. I'm speaking to Siobhan Clarke. She is a somatic trauma release counselor, which sounds extremely interesting. And I'm very interested to hear more about it because I've never experienced it myself, but I know people that have done it. And it is rather physical and sort of a process that is done to you to release trauma. For many of us, myself included, it is very hard to either find the time or to go deep enough into our minds that we really, really get down into the bottom of the trauma that we have stored from childhood in order to release it. So somatic trauma release is something that assists us in doing this, with the intention of then creating a life filled with joy as the metric of wellness. So welcome, Siobhan. Thank you so much for being here.
Hi, thank you for having me.
I think we should jump right into it because I'm, as I said, very, very interested in what you have to say. And I'm sure everyone listening is as well. So I think that, a lot of the time for many people, when, we set ourselves up with all of these metrics in life, and what we think a successful life looks like, we have to be achieving a certain amount. We have to be exercising a certain amount. We have to be eating a certain way, sleeping a certain number of hours, present with our families, present with ourselves, having downtime, also being productive and constructive. And it's never ending, and especially for those A-type amongst us, and I am front and center in that group, it's basically setting ourselves up for a constant feeling of disappointment and failure. And then the mindset is, well, clearly I don't have enough discipline. If I'm not ticking all of these boxes that I have created for myself, clearly I'm the problem. But what if the problem isn't discipline? What if the problem is actually that we are deeply dysregulated? So in your opinion, and before we get into the actual trauma release and what you do as a practitioner, I wanted to ask, why do you think, do you agree with that statement? Why do you think that so many people are failing at these routines that they set up for themselves? Do you think that there is a massive pandemic, might be a little bit dramatic, but, a sort of massive a crisis of people feeling inherently dysregulated, which is why they're unable to meet these ridiculous commitments they've made to themselves?
I think that you've hit the nail on the head with that one. And it's so pertinent because we're so inundated with all this information, especially from, no shade at social media, but it can, I think, get a little overwhelming with all the information and with everyone sort of being disciplined and having these routines of cold plunges and red lights and this and this and this and this. And I'm not throwing shade at any of that either because it's extremely supportive and very, very important for wellness on many different levels. But I think that we're all looking at it from one lens and we're not saying, where am I in all of this? And what is my lifestyle? And like you've said, where's my nervous system at? So a lot of us try and jump into these sort of cut and paste routines. I think there's one called Blueprint that has this really, really strict, rigid sort of routine. And again, I think it's beautiful and I think it's great. And it's probably doing a lot of supportive wellness with many people, but it's very, very rigid. And for the average Joe like us, it's not necessarily conducive to our lifestyle. So we're jumping into something that actually dysregulates us more. Now, what is dysregulation? So this is when I'm constantly tired. I'm feeling on edge, or maybe I'm also just shut down. I've got immense amount of brain fog. My hormones might be whack, especially with current perimenopause or even, menopause, this stage of our life. We're not meant to be pushing so hard, right? And again, I don't mean that we shouldn't be pushing hard, but pushing hard is native to where you're at in your life right now. So if I'm really shut down and I'm tired all the time, that probably indicates that I could be burnt out, right? Now, if I'm going to go lift really heavy weights at the gym and be running and doing all these cold plunges, that's actually going to exacerbate my nervous system even more, and I'm going to be more burnt out because my brain and body just doesn't have the capacity for that. So essentially, you can think of your nervous system and your adrenal glands like a bank account. Every time I withdraw, I am now minimizing what I have in there. So if I'm completely withdrawn, I'm now in the red, and I'm going to keep making a withdrawal. I'm going to get less and less and less, and my body can't come back to that baseline. Even though our bodies have a blueprint to be able to come back to that homeostasis, which is our baseline, it doesn't have the regulatory tools or even nutrients to be able to do that if I'm constantly withdrawing. So in a sort of roundabout way, discipline is great, and this is something we can work towards, but we need to have a necessary regulated state to do that. I hope that answered your question. I felt like I went down a little bit of a road there.
Not at all. No, it answers my question perfectly, because it's actually very interesting. A previous guest that I had on the podcast was speaking about supplementation, and then kind of does a energy field reading to kind of identify where you are in terms of your nervous system, and did mine. And it was so interesting because I am a hot yoga, high intensity madness, on a daily basis enthusiast of note. And I genuinely believe that it feeds my soul more than anything. And it's, my 1 hour of the day, 1.5 hours that's to myself, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that was the first thing that she identified. She was like, you are running in the red, and that type of exercise is the worst for you. And it's very interesting because I'm meaning to actually call her, I haven't done it yet, and have that discussion to say, how do we, and I think I'm now going on a segue, off on a tangent. This is a different episode maybe, but this is an interesting discussion. Like, how do you outweigh, if it makes you feel really good, but actually it's depleting you? But anyway, that's not our next question. Our next question is about the stored trauma. So if we're talking about somatic trauma release and the fact that so many of us have stored trauma in our bodies, I find this incredibly interesting because I know so many people that have been through things that undoubtedly have left a trauma imprint in their bodies. In fact, I don't know anyone that hasn't, in varying degrees. And some people are very good at processing this. And some people, again, I use myself always as the example because I know myself best, are incredibly talented at pushing it down all the way down to the bottom, putting a few boxes on top of it, then a few more, then, some clothes and whatever. And that's where it's going to stay. And God forbid we ever go down there and try and sort of bring it up and process it, because ultimately, as you get older, especially if you have children, you have a busy career, you have a husband, you have a partner, whatever it is, they become a priority, not the priority, but a priority, meaning we have less time to focus on our personal priorities. So it kind of feels like homework that you just don't really have time to get around to doing, So my question to you is, what does it look like, this stored trauma? Because I think so many people are walking around with it, but they're fine. They're okay. So really, is it something that we can just be like, oh, I know it's there, but, I'll get to it maybe when I'm retired and I'm sitting on a beach somewhere and I have the time to unpack it, or I won't? Or do you think that it's something that no matter what, it needs to be addressed and processed in some way?
Very interesting question, because I think, again, it's very unique to every single person's story and where they are, and again, their nervous system. So I like to also think of the nervous system as a bottle. and life happens and it pours into the bottle and pours into the bottle. And eventually it gets to a time where there's no more space in the bottle and it overflows. And this is where we see sort of breakdowns, anxiety, symptomatic work, like even depression and all the different things we sort of work with when it comes to trauma therapy. And somatic therapy is very similar to that in terms of the bottle analogy, where we have an emotional imprint of everything that's ever happened in our lives. So let's use a common trauma, for example, like a hijacking. Let's say that happened when I was a teenager, a very, very prime part of our life as well. So essentially, maybe, we deal with it a little bit, life carries on, I go back to school, things happen, but then further down the line, now suddenly I am having panic attacks. And I don't even know why. I was just sitting watching Netflix one evening and suddenly I just went full-blown panic attack and I couldn't tell you what happened or what triggered it. So this is where we're seeing that sort of somatic emotional imprint. And there's different schools of thought on why that would occur as well, but it sort of all roots down into the fact that our body sort of remembers. And I think there's that very famous book from Dr. Siobhan Clarke, which is The Body Remembers. So essentially my cognitive mind has moved on, but the body sort of has this level of stuck energy. And I say stuck because it's not necessarily like it's sitting there in limbo waiting. It's just that our body has that imprint itself. And I love that you used that word earlier because it literally is like a stamp, right? Where anything in our brain is really, really fickle about what could trigger this into being in the moment of now, so to speak, where it could just be the light coming in at a certain angle that reminds the brain of the pattern of that sort of trauma that I experienced, because that would now be highlighted in the background. Our brain is always accessing these moments in life to check for patterns because its number one rule is to keep us safe, to survive, right? So what happens is it's scanning what's in front of me, scanning what's in the background, checking for familiarity or patterns, so to speak, and then creating an output. So we don't necessarily have free will in the way we think we have free will. We have free won't, you could say. So just to divert a little bit, if you were sitting next to me and I threw a ball at you, you would have some form of automatic response. So either you would like catch the ball or you'd duck or you'd hit it back, but there would be some form of response to that. That is your automatic response based on predictive sort of programming where you were taught to catch a ball and hit the ball and all those different things. So now in that moment, the brain utilized all the times you've ever went in the background, it scanned everything in a few seconds and then had that output, which was, let's say, you caught the ball. So this is very similar to how we deal with triggers, so to speak, is that our brain has noticed in our environment that something is very, very familiar to a time that was life-threatening to us. And our brain doesn't tell the difference between a hijacking, a breakup, our grade 2 teachers shouting at us and telling us we'd amount to nothing. So anything that creates pain and suffering within the body and the mind will be deemed traumatic. And again, it's also dependent on where our nervous system's at. So I may not be traumatized by my partner leaving me, but someone else could be. And it would be very, very detrimental to them. It doesn't make it less traumatic. It's just that this is where my nervous system is at, where my life is, my priorities, and everything sort of in between. And this dictates now that I'm traumatized, right? And it can be just as much trauma as having a gun against your head in terms of the way the nervous system responds. So now to sort of circle back to what somatic sort of therapy and release is in this context is we're dealing with the imprint of something that my mind has more than likely gotten over. Now, a lot of the cases we haven't gotten over, and that's totally fine. It doesn't necessarily differ in that state, but we're looking at more symptomatic work like generalized anxiety disorder, which you'll see in, a lot of 20-olds or anyone really, but more so at the moment with social media, critical parents, the amount of homework, school tells us, already instills an essence of shame. If you're not doing well enough, you fail, then you're not a good enough human. Or, if you're not top A, you're not good enough and you're just not the best. So it sucks to be you type of thing. So already we're seeing the sort of trauma side of shame in that space, and my body's remembering that. And as I get older, I'm now dealing with the emotional impact and the imprint of that on a somatic level too. So this can also look at lack of self-confidence and, again, anxiety, depression, mood disorders, all these different sort of symptomatic diagnoses that we're looking at, which is actually just the body still holding on to that experience and re-experiencing it in the moment because it noticed that pattern. it sort of triggered that pattern for the brain to go, oh, I know what this is. I behaved this way last time and I survived. Therefore, I need to behave like that again because it's just predictive programming.
I mean, sure. It's my brain right now is sparking off a million different instances. Not for me, for my kids actually. That I'm thinking, my word, like I can see that in things that happen at home, and that's crazy. And I'm now conflicted because I've got two different questions that I want to ask that are both completely pertain to this. So I'm going to choose one, but then I can't lose the second because they're both really interesting. So the first one, and you speaking about younger adults and children, so sort of 20 somethings, even late teens. And again, because you kind of triggered thoughts of things that have happened with my kids. How do you know, because of the fact that, you mentioned social media and all of these things it's a very fine line between, a lot of people these days, social media it's the devil, but it's also the respite, it's kind of like it's when we are feeling overwhelmed and life is getting too much. There are few things that feel more like a reward than collapsing on your couch with a cup of tea and, looking through absolute nonsense on Instagram for half an hour. And kids, I know, obviously do this, I think, way more than most of us adults, to the point that it becomes detrimental. So if we're talking about stored trauma and trauma release, how do we identify, even as parents for our kids or kids for themselves or adults for ourselves, the difference between needing more regulation or actually needing discipline? So how do we recognize when we're at the point of, okay, sitting on the couch, doom scrolling is actually doing more harm than good, put it down, do something else because this is a trauma response, or, actually you are needing to just take a load off, sit on the couch and do nothing because you're completely dysregulated and in a state of nervous dysregulation. I'm asking you these broad questions that I'm expecting you to give me bullet point answers in 5 minutes to. And I know that there are broad questions, but are there sort of easy to spot signals or symptoms or something that we could, even pull out of this episode and give to listeners to say, these are the kinds of things and these are the certain points that you should stop and realize that this is happening? Sure.
So let's answer the question about kids first, because if I'm correct, you're asking about how we can sort of notice this in our kids and whether that fine line we're crossing is, sure, let them chill on the couch for a bit and, zone out a bit, or are we trying to help them with some nervous regulation and, what's the difference, so to speak? Is that right?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. So
well, not just kids, ourselves as well. I mean, in general.
Right. Okay. So I think if we're looking at the perspective of watching our kids, let's start there. And also it's very age dependent. So, I think if we're looking at the sort of younger kids, we want to sort of steer away from, zoning out. But I think, and I'm probably going to be chastised for this, I think sometimes it is important to let them zone out a little bit. We all do it. We all have been brought up zoning out a little bit. I don't mean on social media. I mean, maybe watching something on Netflix, obviously something age appropriate, but allowing them to have that zone out time because they're so stimulated all the time. Now, I do recognize that TV has its own form of stimulation, so we want to be careful about what we're stimulating them with on TV. Like Cocomelon is an absolute no-no. It's addictive. They've created it to be addictive, and it just lights up all the different parts of the brain. But obviously, that's a separate thing, and I want to try to stay on course with your question. So, noticing what's happening with my child also. What is their attitude like? The first sort of behavioral thing we see in kids when they're super dysregulated is a change in mood. So even though, and again, age dependent, we might look at our younger girls from, 8 to about 12, because obviously they're starting to menstruate quite early these days. That would have a normal sort of mood change in that. But we're talking about, your child, if they're so shy, suddenly they're outgoing. That's a huge difference, right? I'm not saying they shouldn't be outgoing, but why all of a sudden are they having this change in mood or change in attitude or personality? But if your child is very outgoing and they start to get quiet, then that's also sort of a shift. Noticing that my child's tired all the time could also indicate burnout, right? Because they've got so much going on at the moment, constantly on the go type of thing. So that's also something we can look at. very cranky. Kids tend to get extremely cranky when they're burnt out, like sassy, even though sassy, again, different conversation, is quite healthy for kids to be to a certain extent because it shows autonomy, but essentially over crankiness, over sassiness, over disrespect, all these sort of things we see in kids where this is not like my child, and I can notice some things up. So also trust your mum gut with all of that. And then we want to start looking at like a slower pace of nervous system regulation. And maybe, we're looking at ourselves and focusing on ourselves in terms of doing these beautiful wellness things. There are some really nice ones for kids, like Pray for Kids, which is also a neurogenic tremor, which is really, really nice. And it's gentle for them to, even fascia work, really, really gentle stuff because their nervous systems are still developing. So we've also got to be aware that they don't have integration tools. Their nervous system's very young and it's still learning. So a big part of them learning regulation is what are we doing? And they learn by modeling. So mom gets angry. What does she do when she's angry? My parent fights. How do they repair that fight? And then they sort of model that as they get older. So it's not sort of perfect until they're probably late adults. And then in terms of us, how do we know that I need a zone out and how do I know that I need regulation? So I think that that's also a fine line, like you've said. There's nothing wrong with having a little bit of a zone out, but there's got to be a point when we say, okay, now this has become sort of addiction. Like, how do I feel afterwards? How do I feel before? Right? How often am I engaging in this? Because I think with anything, a little bit is okay, but abundance of it is not okay in terms of, same as drinking wine, doing whatever someone does to escape, so to speak, because it's a form of escape. So nervous system regulation should be more of a routine, and I hate to use that word because we just spoke about having a routine, but essentially it's something that I prioritize, like brushing my teeth. I don't really think about brushing my teeth, and I'm not talking about someone that's severely shut down and depressed, because even that would be too much for them, but naturally what we would address that in therapy. But essentially for us normies, there would be something like I wash my hair, brush my teeth, and then do some 5 minutes of regulation that makes me feel good. Not something that I'm doing because I'm like, oh, I have to do this. It's something that I look forward to doing because it actually physically has a difference in my life, and I can feel the physiological change after doing it. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah. It does, and it's completely distracted me from the follow-up question because I now have a different question that I need to ask before, but that's a good sign. I believe that it's also it's tuning in, and it's something that I always thought that I personally was quite good at, and I also had a lot of people in my life that I looked at that I thought were very good at it, and I'm realizing more and more that it's genuinely just sort of with maturity and wisdom and age and those wonderful things that you start to realize, because I think it's when you start going more into your body and less in your head that you can feel, on those days that you wake up. And because I'm thinking now about the wellness routines that we use as regulation tools, as I said in the beginning, how those can sometimes become the tools that are burning us out. And I believe that it's also just a case of, and again, it's a fine line, it's a case of listening to, when you wake up in the morning, are you genuinely excited to go and do that, insanely high energy aerobics heated class, and it's going to do you good and it's going to make you feel wonderful? Or are you going to end that class feeling like I'm now finished for the day? In which case, maybe do the low energy one that day. And that's also okay, because the benefits that we're getting should not just be only physical. And it's something that I'm trying very hard to sort of teach by example at home, because I do think that it's, for many years in our 20s and 30s, most of us do what's on the schedule or what we believe is the right thing to do because that's what we do when we're high functioning and successful, And it's just more a case of just be in it. Just, sort of think to yourself like, oh, even if you're in the class, you got to the studio, you're on the mat, you're doing whatever, take it down a notch if you feel like it. It's okay. You don't always have to be, the one sort of pushing the hardest. And it's an interesting one for me, because my fitness routine is always my regulation routine. And it's a very interesting juxtaposition when you start realizing the dichotomy there, that the thing that you're using to make you feel better could also be used to make you feel worse if you overdo it. So yeah, just that's more a comment and a question. But the next one that I wanted to ask, and it's something that I'm sure is not a one size fits all answer, But somatic trauma release, what you do, and the way that you help people release stored trauma in their bodies, regardless of the age or where the trauma comes from, etc. Is it possible for you to talk us through that process? How, what do you do and how does it feel? Is it a once-off treatment? Is it a repeat treatment? Is it something that you then leave people with the tools to be able to do on their own after they've seen you?
So yes, and yes to all of your questions.
Fantastic. Would have been a very short episode otherwise.
It's a very important question, and I love that because somatic release, as we've sort of termed it, is very, very unique to everyone and to every single tool we use. So I use a very specialized set of tools that are unique to my practice, to what I've sort of studied. And I think every sort of somatic practitioner also has their own flair, but also what they've studied, because there's so many different tools out there. So a lot of what I focus on is the vagus nerve, as with all somatic training. So I'll start there now. And that is what I think craniologists also call the 10th cranial nerve. So it's a nerve that runs from the brain stem, which is obviously our computer, it's the software of the computer of our mind and our bodies, and runs into every single organ and muscle, fiber, tissue of our bodies. And that is sort of the autonomic nervous system switch. So that switches up and switches down, not practically like that, but of course, let's say that this is how it occurs. And it tells us whether we're going to be hyper, whether we're going to be hypo, which is shut down, or whether we can be in a normal state of, social structure, which is what you and I are in at the moment. Now, when it comes to somatic therapy, we're working with the way the body has stored that emotional imprint. And it's not necessarily that everyone has these really massive responses that we see on social media, because everyone has a different level of awareness, like you've mentioned earlier. So a lot of A-type personalities don't necessarily have these massive flares of release because they're very disconnected between their mind and their body to some extent, because they're always in their minds, overthinking, risk assessing, planning, etc. So there's, not the sort of connection on a moment-to-moment basis where you're constantly studying your sensations, where maybe someone with a higher level of anxiety might do so because they're constantly tuned into, is my heart beating fast? Is my hand sweating? What's happening? All these different sort of scenarios that's going on in their mind. So it also depends on the tool that we're using, whether we'd have some sort of massive release in terms of someone, you see some Instagram videos where there's like this sort of tremoring like this and that, called a neurogenic tremor, or people are like shouting and screaming. I think there's one that's gone a bit viral with Leanne Rimes, where she was having that sort of fascia release in her jaw. So it also depends on how long you've been working with it. Some people have a massive response in the first session. Some people take time to sort of build up because that trust within their mind and their body isn't there. Our bodies don't like to be out of control. So now if you're looking at having a neurogenic tremor, which can be induced via different somatic therapies, the body goes, no, what are you doing? No, and sort of blocks it. You can sometimes even feel that, where the body sort of shakes and trembles a little bit and then stop. Because the body goes, no, I'm in control here. You can't do that. And it's sort of these two different paradoxical scenarios where there is the want to do it and the actual doing it, and then the sort of stopping in the mind going, I'm in control. I don't want you to do anything. So it can be very, very gentle in terms of that release. Most somatic therapy is gentle to begin with. So I work with something called spinal energetics. I work with fascia. I do neurogenic tremoring. I also do acu-detox, and these all work at different levels as well. So acu-detox is acupuncture of the ear. This is very, very subtle but very powerful. So it works by stimulating the trigeminal nerve here, which is connected to your vagus nerve, which tells the body immediately to switch off into parasympathetic, which is our rest and digest. And sometimes you can get this really visceral within the second needle. And then you just sort of, most people fall asleep because your body's like, oh, yes, repair. Yes, please. But the main point of somatic therapy is to also bring in your body's natural healing response. So our bodies have a blueprint as to how to heal. So if you think of, you break your arm, immediately your body will start healing that arm, and in a few weeks, you're healed. You can use your arm. Everything is generally fine. So our bodies have that innate wisdom, so to speak. What somatic therapy is doing is just allowing the body to sort of move what in its way, so to speak, and bring forth that sort of blueprint of healing. Now that block and that dispelled energy comes out in that way because sometimes during trauma, that residue of emotional trauma is sort of stuck in the body, so to speak. And this now, you can think of it like a stream. The stream gets blocked. Now we're just opening the stream and the stream can now flow. Because sometimes we go into a sort of stuck trauma response. And that's stuck, we needed to actually fight or we needed to run away, or maybe we were so scared we froze. Now that sort of energy of that trauma is stuck in the body and needs to continue, which means maybe I actually needed to continue running away just to dispel that energy of that trauma. Does that make sense?
Yes. I am the first person to, and I can hear myself saying this as I'm saying it out loud to you. I mean, I can hear myself having said it a million times in my life when talking about stored trauma and why I've chosen to not try again and again with trying to process it and, sort of heal it or whatever, is because I didn't feel like I had the capacity in my life, to actually let all of that come up. And, you sort of imagine yourself then becoming this complete emotional wreck for weeks or months and everything makes you cry and you can't function and and I think a lot of people do have that perception of perhaps that blockage is actually keeping me functioning at the level that I'm functioning because the reason I haven't processed that is because it'll be too powerful for me to process and continue functioning. Is that absolute nonsense or is it true? Because as you said, our minds are programmed to keep us alive and I would imagine also keep us functioning. So is that something that our brain will control, or have you seen that in someone that has undergone a successful trauma release, they then become, overly emotional and then you almost have to be dealing with that situation?
So excellent question. Really, really important. And I think there is this sort of viewpoint that even therapy leaves you feeling terrible all the time and you've got to sort of approach things in a way that leaves you feeling overwhelmed. And I think, sure, if you're not using the correct tools and, with skilled therapists as well, that shouldn't necessarily be the case, right? I don't know how other people work, and there are a lot of different successful therapies out there outside of what I do because I don't claim to know everything. But in terms of preventing someone from being exceptionally overwhelmed, there's absolutely processes there that help people not experience it. And that's really why you're coming to an experienced therapist, is to help you contain that release, so to speak. So even though it's a release of that containment, you're still sort of integrating that at the end where you're not staying in that sort of stuck position. So essentially you're feeling lighter, you're feeling calmer because now your body isn't holding it. You can imagine holding this really heavy backpack filled with rocks. Now every time you do a release, that rock leaves your backpack. And eventually all the rocks are out of your backpack and you feel, and it feels absolutely amazing. In my own practice, I sort of start a little bit with cognitive stuff. I don't mean to punt my work here, but brain recursive therapy is something that I use mostly at the beginning just to help rewire that in the automatic response, so in the automatic brainstem that houses all the trauma, and then gently move into somatic therapy to sort of lessen and decrease the somatic imprint of that experience that you're having. So again, you're doing a cognitive and a somatic process where you're not overwhelmed. And especially in the BWT sessions, you leave feeling lighter and amazing because now that's no longer in your mind. Your body's no longer carrying that, which is amazing. And most somatic therapy does that too. So you're generally feeling lighter. You're feeling there's space to actually smile now because that imprint is really what's weighing you down. And that imprint is what's keeping you stuck in that overwhelm and that fear and all the different aspects that go along with it. Where now you're sort of clearing that space, you're emptying that bottle, so you've got more space in your bottle for other stuff. Stress is way less. Let's say that your bottle is full and now you just keep adding stuff. That stress is going to impact you 10 times more than it would be if you've got half a bottle full, so to speak. And that's what you're doing, is you're emptying your bottle, so even the everyday stresses don't seem to matter as much anymore. And you feel obviously have more space to have that joy and that contentment and the different things. So you have more resilience and capacity to deal with stuff.
So, I mean, effectively what I'm getting from this is that it's, and I said this in the beginning, in the intro, it's it's kind of like a therapy that's being done to you as opposed to a therapy that you have to sit and verbally partake in, because many of us are pretty shut down when it comes to really being very open in terms of what we've experienced, or we actually don't remember things very clearly because, again, your brain, I think, tends to translate things maybe in a way that's more palatable or safer or whatever, and it's actually not really what happened. So I mean, that sounds incredible for me, because I feel like that's something that everyone should benefit from, whether or not you're aware of the level of trauma that is stored in your body. But the one thing that I just wanted to ask you to go through again, because you mentioned the acu-detox and the ear acupuncture and that you might just fall asleep. But in terms of the other therapies, physically, what does that feel like? Is it you hands-on to the person being treated? Is it a machine? Is it what is the duration like physically? Is it a movement practice? Is it more of a movement of energy? If I were to be in your studio right now sitting with you, what would you be doing from start to finish within that session in order to conduct this process of somatic release?
So also the different sort of processes have different level of touch, so to speak. So if I'm doing my NSR, which is neurosomatic therapy, and it's a combination of meridian therapy with fascia, etc., that is a very hands-on therapy. So what we're doing is we're releasing fascia within the body to release that stored trauma, because the fascia is sort of a conductive tissue that also communicates with our autonomic nervous system. So this is that Leanne Rimes video that people saw. I don't necessarily work in the jaw, but I do work in different parts of the body, sometimes the full body to balance it. And this would require me to touch the body and do certain movements to shift the fascia within that. And yes, there can be sort of small movements. There can be large movements within that throughout the session, because it's generally about 40 minutes to 60 minutes in the single sessions, because I also do group sessions. So that could also result in what we call a neurogenic tremor, which sometimes is that tremor that you see people doing and they sort of look like this, or it can be very subtle where it's just a little bit of a shake. And sometimes, yes, there is emotions that come up. So spontaneous crying, spontaneous laughing actually happens very frequently, where someone just bursts into laughter and can't stop. There is sometimes in the odd occasion a scream if someone allows themselves to, because that's also, people feel very uncomfortable having these, especially in, I'm new to you. People feel embarrassed. They feel awkward. They don't want to be seen having these spontaneous movements. So they sort of suppress that on either a conscious or a subconscious level. But essentially, you'll see, especially with the fascia, if I'm working on someone's spine, is you'll see this sort of twitching in the shoulder, and that's just the body reorganizing itself. Or you'll see sort of this light head movement, which is the body reorganizing the spinal area. Or you'll see that you'll suddenly start getting uncomfortable and you move, people start to shift quite frequently because the body is reorganizing. Now, that can leave you feeling a little heavy for a day or two, but it's never generally longer than 48 hours. But again, it's part of the integration process. We are releasing something within the body that's stored imprint, and it's going to be sitting there, but it's dissipating, right? So sometimes, yes, I can go through a day where I feel really, really teary, but that lifts, thankfully, and you feel lighter. You have more energy, because that's just the process and the nature of that stuck energy sitting and then flowing through and moving out. And that is just very natural when it comes to any form of therapy, really. When it comes to, say, spinal energetics, it's a light touch modality where we're working in the subtle energies of the body, the layers of the energy within the body, but allowing the nervous system to reorganize through the spine itself. The neural patterns of how it holds that in the different layers within the spine as well. We're sort of working on that energy system and allowing the body to reorganize itself. You'll see that their page probably has the most amount of videos depicting people having these really massive reliefs where they're having these really big trauma sort of shaking releases and they're moving like snakes. And this is also just the nature of people feeling comfortable enough to let their body speak to them and move, because sometimes the body's like, oh, suddenly you just feel that overwhelming urge to like click something. Mm-hmm. That's what happens with spinal energetics too. But then with my A-type personalities, they generally a little bit smaller movements. You can see the muscle twitching in the neck. You can see, if you look closely on the back, they're sort of rippling in the spine on the skin. You'll see twitching in the calves. You'll see the feet, sort of the toes kind of doing that, or hands start to twitch. Even eyes start to twitch. but essentially it's just the body reorganizing the nervous system, the fascia, or the organs around, just to come back to that sort of homeostasis. So some people feel like, well, what did you just do? Nothing happened, but then super tired the next day. Just because you can't feel it doesn't mean it's not happening below the surface. And let me tell you something, you'll feel it. But it's good because the more you do it, the more you engage in that, the lighter, the more capacity you feel. So I think I just wanted to answer your question previously is, sure, they can have really big trauma releases in one session, but as humans, we have continuous flow of emotions. So somatic therapy ideally should be done regularly in terms of releasing what it needs to release, right? So it's something that, sure, you can do once off, but like with anything, once off isn't going to solve the entire world's problem, so to speak. It's got to be something continuous. I suppose consistent would be great, depending on what you want and what your goal is, but essentially something that will just really benefit you on a day-to-day basis in terms of nervous system capacity.
Yeah, it's so interesting, and I say this to too many of my guests. I think that this is the beginning of a few conversations because there clearly is so much to delve into in this topic. And to reiterate what I said at the beginning of the episode, it's sounding somewhat trite to talk about just search for joy, just use joy as the metric, even though I believe in it so strongly. When we do, the vast majority of us have a level of trauma and uncertainty and dysregulation to clear first. So I hope that we will see you again here
Anytime.
to talk further and try and arm people with more tools to deal with this type of trauma and regulation of themselves. So yeah, thank you to everyone that was listening, and thank you, Siobhan. This was also our first virtual podcast interview, which is quite exciting. It's opened up the whole world to the Mama Mudra podcast. And yeah, Siobhan is also someone that we're very much looking forward to having at a Sunshine People event in the future. So watch out for that. And if this episode resonated with you and you enjoyed it, please tell everyone about it. Send it to everyone, like it, subscribe to the channels, show us some love. And thank you very much for the time watching.